I've always liked old cars. Not those models that everyone drools over today, like the restored Mustangs or the shiny Camaros on show. I liked a car that had a soul, that had a history, that carried the dust of the years in its engine and the memory of a bygone era in its seats. And that's why I never got rid of my old 1970 Plymouth Barracuda. It had been in the family for decades, passed down from generation to generation like a treasure, even though in many people's eyes it looked more like a junkyard on wheels than an automotive classic. But who cares what other people think, right? Well, apparently, Karen from the neighborhood did. If you've ever dealt with one of these creatures in their natural habitat, a middle-class, wealthy neighborhood dominated by a residents' association that thinks it's in charge of what you eat for breakfast, you know exactly the type. She lived 2 houses down from me, in one of those magazine houses where every flower in the garden seemed to have been planted by an architect specializing in fake rich aesthetics. Ever since I moved here, she looked at me with disgust, not because I was a delinquent or because I threw noisy parties. The problem was my car. While the other neighbors paraded around in their shiny SUVs and modern hybrid sedans, there was my old Plymouth, parked in the garage like a war survivor. The bodywork was worn, some parts still needed repainting, and the engine, well, it made a noise that didn't please Madam's sensitive ears. And so, one fine day, the plague struck. I received an official letter from the HOA, signed by none other than the woman. On the paper, in formal words, the notice said that my car was a violation of the visual standard of the neighborhood. In short, I was being fined for having an ugly car. But the icing on the cake was the polite suggestion at the end of the letter. We recommend that the vehicle be removed from the property or taken to a suitable storage facility, thus avoiding future penalties. In other words, not only did I have to pay the fine, I also had to get rid of the car. For the good of the neighborhood, of course. I laughed. I laughed out loud. The kind of laughter that comes when you realize that the world really is full of clueless, unbothered people. But the show didn't stop there. 3 days later, she showed up at my door in person, as if she didn't think her little letter was enough to make me throw my family heirlooms in the scrapyard. She wore a pastel blue blazer that screamed, "I'm important," and held her clipboard as if she were about to announce that my house had been sold without my consent. "I'm sure you've received the notification," she said, without even bothering to feign sympathy. I didn't want to talk. I just smiled and shut the door in her face. And that's when the war began. Over the next few days, the woman began to torment me like a spiteful ghost. She called the HOA all the time, made a disgusted face every time she walked past my garage, and went so far as to suggest that my car was lowering the value of the properties on the street. I could almost hear her crying every time my engine rumbled louder than the quiet Teslas in the neighborhood. But the final blow came when, one fine Sunday, I found a tow truck sticker stuck to the windshield of my car. She had called a tow truck to take my car away without my permission. And it was at that moment that I realized the woman wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. But what she didn't know was that this car wasn't just some piece of junk. She had just messed with the wrong person, and she herself would soon find out just how big a mistake she had made. The next morning began with a feeling of revolt bubbling up inside me. When I looked out of the window and saw my car there, still intact, I breathed a sigh of relief, but I also felt a growing hatred burning in my chest. That sticker on the windshield looked like a war warning. I knew it hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It hadn't been a neighbor quietly complaining. No, this was simply a planned attack by a woman who thought she owned the street. I ripped the sticker off and crumpled it in my hands. I knew that if I didn't do something, she wouldn't stop. She had the typical energy of someone who grew up believing they could control everything and everyone around them. The kind of person who thinks she can dictate rules in spaces that don't even belong to her. But this time, she chose the wrong person to torment. I picked up the phone and called the towing company. I needed to know how far this woman had gone with her antics. When a sleepy attendant answered, I didn't even disguise my irritation. "Hi, I want to know who authorized you to put a removal sticker on my vehicle. It's in my garage, and there's nothing illegal about it." On the other end of the line, the attendant took a second before answering. "Sir, we received a complaint from the Residents Association stating that the vehicle was abandoned and in poor condition, devaluing the neighborhood." Abandoned. My car. I wash it every week. I always start it to keep the engine running, and it's a classic model that's rarer than this woman's common sense. I tried to remain calm, but my tone came out dry and full of sarcasm. "So, you're going to tow away a car in perfect condition because a bored woman has decided it's not pretty enough for the neighborhood?" "Well, sir, the removal agents would carry out an inspection before any action was taken," he replied, now looking a little less comfortable. "And, in fact, the service was cancelled even before the visit." I paused for a moment. "Cancelled?" "Yes." Apparently the applicant himself withdrew the complaint a few hours later. The woman tried to tow my car away and gave up halfway. What the hell was going on? I already knew that she was an insufferable person, but until then, I had believed that she at least had conviction in her madness. But now she seemed to have backtracked without explanation. I left the house determined to go there, but before I could even take 2 steps, she was already on the sidewalk, watching me. She was holding her cell phone in her hand, pretending to be distracted. But I saw the way her eyes flicked quickly across my car, and then back to the screen. She looked strange. It was no longer that arrogant look of someone who thinks she owns the street. There was something different. A hesitation, perhaps? A nervousness that didn't match her usual bossy posture? She must have realized that I had noticed her change in behavior, because she forced a casual expression and crossed her arms. "I see you haven't solved the car problem yet. I see you have plenty of time to worry about things that aren't your problem." She pressed her lips together. She seemed bothered by something, and it wasn't me for the first time. "You know, it might be easier for everyone if you just sell this thing. I'm sure any junkyard would take it." She no longer had the arrogance of before. Now she seemed to be trying to convince me of something, and that made me realize that there was something behind her insistence. If it had just been a tantrum, she would have doubled the bet and slapped me with fines. But the cancellation of the tow truck, and now this weird attempt to convince me to sell the car. Something was wrong. I crossed my arms and stared at the woman, trying to read what was going on in her mind. "Why do you care so much?" She laughed, forcefully, but her eyes avoided mine. "I don't mind. I just think it would be better for the aesthetics of the neighborhood." That's a lie. I knew it was a lie. She was hiding something. And that's when it happened. A black car drove slowly down the street. It didn't belong to any neighbors I knew. It had dark windows, an older model but very well maintained. The kind of car that someone who understands classic vehicles would drive. And it was at that very moment that I understood everything. The woman's eyes followed the car. The discomfort on her face was evident. She knew. She had figured it out. For some reason, she had discovered that my car was worth a lot of money. My mind connected the dots instantly. Maybe it was a collector who passed by and recognized the model. Maybe she'd done an internet search after giving me so much hell and landed on some auction site. But now it all made sense. The sudden cancellation of the tow truck, the nervousness, the attempt to get me to sell the car, as if she wanted me to get rid of it before anyone made an offer. She wanted me not to realize what she had in her hands. But now I was in control of the situation. I gave a half smile, feeling the adrenaline rush through my body. "You know what? I was thinking of selling it myself." Her face lit up for a second, and I saw the satisfaction shining in her eyes. "Really?" "Yes. But, of course, now that I've realized what I really have, I'll wait for the best offer." And that's when I saw her expression crumble. She opened her mouth to say something, but closed it again. If I had any doubts about what was going on before, now everything was clear as day. The woman didn't want me to sell the car. She wanted me to sell it before I knew what it was really worth. In the days that followed, The woman looked like a time bomb about to explode. She could no longer hide her discomfort. Whenever I walked down the street, I could feel her eyes on me, as if she wanted to control my movements. Her car passed slowly in front of my house. Its neck turned in such a brazen way that even the other neighbors began to notice. But the best thing was her desperate attempt to pretend that nothing had changed. She still frowned when she saw my Plymouth parked, still wrinkled her nose and muttered something to herself, as if she were repeating some mantra against old cars. But it was no longer about the aesthetics of the neighborhood, but about a wrong move she had made. She knew she had lost her edge. It was funny to see how the neighborhood began to change its mind after the truth about my car began to circulate. That black car that drove past the other day wasn't just a random visitor. It was a collector, and a very influential one at that, because suddenly everyone wanted to be my friend. The neighbor who had never exchanged a word with me now greeted me with a toothpaste commercial smile. The couple from the house across the road, who used to ignore me completely, started talking to me every time I went out to water the plants. Even the idiot from the HOA, who always accompanied his wife to meetings and looked on while she gave me hell, sent me an email apologizing for any inconvenience caused by the previous notifications. The blow was so strong that even the woman's tone changed. She no longer talked about my car as a rusty piece of junk, much less tried to convince the neighbors that it should be towed away. Now the approach was different, a subtler, more insinuating tone, as if she thought she could bend me in a different way. And that's how she turned up at my gate one Saturday morning, with that fake smile that seemed to be stuck to her face with adhesive tape. "You know, I've been thinking," she began, leaning against the railing as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Maybe I was a bit hasty about your car." I crossed my arms and stared at the scene like someone watching bad theater. She tilted her head sideways, feigning casualness. "Actually, a family friend saw some photos of the car and was very interested. He collects classic cars. I could introduce you to it if you're interested in selling it." Her mask was cracking. That woman was trying to sell me my own car, as if I was stupid enough to fall for her bullshit. But now I wanted to play around a bit. "What a coincidence," I replied, smiling. "A lot of people are interested, too. I think I've finally realized the real value of this car." The way her face contorted gave me indescribable satisfaction. She hadn't expected that. The game she had tried to play was falling apart in her face. She blinked a few times, trying to formulate her next sentence, but there wasn't much left to say. When she realized I wasn't going to give in, she turned her back and walked away, frustration brimming with every step. The only thing that intrigued me was how quickly she retreated. The woman wasn't the type to give up easily, so something was wrong, and I was right. The following week, I received a formal email from the HOA, not a generic apology like the one I'd received before, but a new infringement notice. This time, they said that my car was taking up undue space and that I needed to find an alternative storage location. I knew it was her doing. She was trying to find any loophole to force me to move my car. Perhaps she thought that, with no option, I would sell soon, and her chance would still be there. But she underestimated how stubborn I could be. I wasn't going to move that car an inch. I replied to the email attaching copies of the HOA's regulations and pointing out that there was no clause prohibiting the presence of vintage vehicles in the garage. And then, like a broken clock trying to tick, the HOA replied the next day rejecting my challenge and stating that the decision had already been made. It was obvious. It had pulled the strings internally. But that was the last straw. I wasn't going to play passively anymore. Now it was my turn to act. I picked up my phone and made a few calls. First to a lawyer, then to the same collector who had passed through the neighborhood a few days ago. And then, the following Sunday, I made a point of leaving my garage open. If the woman thought she could mess with me and get away with it, she was about to learn a lesson. Sunday dawned with a blue sky so perfect that it seemed ironic. It was as if the universe was in a box seat, waiting to watch the downfall of a person who didn't know when to stop. The woman had been trying desperately to force me out of the car. She tried to intimidate me. She tried to manipulate me. She tried to twist non-existent HOA rules to make me hide it. But her worst mistake was thinking I was an idiot who didn't know what was in my hands. That morning, I left the garage wide open. The Plymouth Barracuda was there, gleaming in the sun. I had spent the previous night giving it a special treatment, cleaning the bodywork, polishing the chrome details, making the car look as imposing as possible. If before it had looked like an old piece ignored in the back of a garage, now it was clear that it was worth a fortune. And the neighborhood noticed. Neighbors who had previously pretended I didn't exist stopped to look. The gossipy couple on the corner came out with their dogs just as a second car pulled up in front of my house. A man in a dark suit and sunglasses got out, looking like a character straight out of a luxury car auction. He was one of the biggest classic car collectors in the region, and, from the enthusiastic tone of his voice on the phone, he knew what he was about to see. As he turned the car around, running his hand along the curves of the bodywork and analyzing every detail, the silence in the street became almost embarrassing. The woman appeared on her sidewalk, paralyzed. She was holding a cup of coffee, but her fingers were so tense that it was only a matter of time before she smashed it. Her gaze went from the car to the collector, then to the neighbors, who were already murmuring among themselves. She knew she had lost. The collector let out a low whistle, looking at me with a satisfied smile. "A real find," he said. "Do you have any idea what this machine is worth?" The woman held her breath. She didn't want to hear the answer, but I wanted her to feel every word like a blade cutting through her arrogance. "Well, some experts estimate that it could be worth between $1.5 and $2 million, depending on the condition." It was as if I had fired a shot in the middle of the street. The neighbors, who were already whispering, practically choked on their own saliva. The woman, on the other hand, remained static. She blinked several times, as if trying to process the number. Until then, she had thought she was in control, that she could pressure me, manipulate me, that I had no idea what was in the garage. But now the whole neighborhood knew that she had tried to find me for a car that was worth more than all the houses on the street combined. The collector still turned to me, excited. "Are you thinking of selling it?" I could have closed a deal right then and there. I could have pocketed the big bucks and come out of this as the big winner. But no, not yet. I wanted it to sink in a bit more. I crossed my arms, pretending to think. I don't know. Now that everyone has realized how much this car is worth, I'm starting to like it even more. The collector's smile widened. "Well, if you change your mind, I can put you in touch with buyers who are extremely interested. But rest assured, cars like this only increase in value." The woman almost fell backwards. The neighbors were already looking at her differently. Some whispered and laughed discreetly, because now it all made sense. She tried to force me to get rid of the car, because she didn't want me to know what it was really worth. And since I'm a generous man, I decided to give her one last present before I put an end to all this nonsense. "Oh, and," I continued, looking casual, "I consulted a lawyer about these unfair HOA fines. As it turns out, trying to remove a legally parked car from private property without permission can be considered harassment and abuse of authority." The silence was so strong that even the birds stopped singing. The HOA, which had always stood by her, was now in the crosshairs of a lawsuit. The woman pressed her lips together, her face red. She knew there was no way out. And then, as every coward does when he loses, she backed down. The next day, a new email arrived from the HOA. This time, it was no longer an infraction, a fine, or a warning. It was an official retraction, stating that the removal of my vehicle was no longer necessary. The woman tried to sweep the story under the carpet, but it was too late. The neighborhood now looked at her differently. The power she thought she had simply evaporated. A few weeks later, I heard a rumor going around. It was said that she was thinking of moving because the neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. The irony? She was the one who made it happen. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.